Okay, today I am joined by Sue Jackson. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be able to speak with you.
Great. So, Sue is an expert on a topic in psychology known as flow. Um, I would say flow is maybe could be thought of as a component of the well being puzzle. But I'll let you
Yeah.
do most of the talking. How would you define flow? What do we need to know about flow before we start getting into the details?
Sure. Well, I agree that flow is very much connected with well-being. It's a key component of positive psychology, which has had a resurgence since the early 2000s. And one of the key people behind that resurgence was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is the founder of flow. And in 2000, he and Martin Seligman, who is also a very big figure in positive psychology, they put out a paper where they were defining the scope of positive psychology. And within that, flow was listed as a central component of positive psychology within the area of positive subjective experience. That is the type of experience that we have as we go through our day, as we go through our life, while we're performing, and so on. So it's very much connected in with that space of positive psychology and well-being.
So, it's probably best to talk about flow via the elements that are characteristic of flow experiences. So, could you talk
Mm.
a little bit about how you might communicate to someone what being in flow would be like?
Yeah, sure. And there are actually 9 quite well defined characteristics of flow. I can go through all 9 of those if you like. Um, but when you're in flow at a more general level, you're totally absorbed in what you're doing to the extent that you no longer are concerned about the things that normally occupy our thinking mind, which is how well am I doing? Do I want to be doing this? What are other people thinking of me? Am I succeeding or not? Like all of those thoughts are absent because all of your attention is put to what you're doing. And it tends to be seen as a very enjoyable state to be in because that concentration isn't perceived as effortful, but actually effortless. That is, we're really focused, we're putting out actually a lot of effort because to be in flow, you're doing something challenging by definition. You're like upping the challenge of your normal everyday experience of challenge. And yet, this attention that you're putting on the task is perceived to be effortless. And I think that has to do somewhat with the fact that you're not having some of your attention pulled to some of these other areas that our mind likes to go to, like what else is happening? Do I want to be doing this? How well am I doing this? And so on. Instead of that, all of the attention's on the task.
So, I have the list here, and you kind of touched on a few of those elements. So, intense concentration, action, and awareness sort of merge together, so that people sort of become the actions that they're engaging in. Uh, a diminished sense of self, which I kind of want to circle back to in a little bit.
Mm.
Um, a sense of control. It feels good. It's rewarding. Um, what are some real life examples that you can point to and say, these are the domains where you're most likely to
Mm.
have a flow experience?
Well, I think one domain, Ryan, that quite was quite associated with flow is sport, and definitely that was my initial interest. My master's and PhD were in sports psychology, and I stumbled across the flow concept actually quite by accident while I was researching what I was going to do for my graduate studies, and I decided that that was a very important area to look at. And I think that in sport, there are conditions in sport that make it conducive to flow. On the other hand, there are some conditions that make it difficult to be in flow. But the ones that are conducive to flow is that there are clear goals about what you are designed to do. Like, you know exactly what you're going to do. Sometimes in a work setting, it might not be so clear. You've got this project, but you're not really sure what component of it you're meant to be focused on or starting. You go into a sports setting, whatever that sport is, there are clearly defined goals. And I'm mentioning that because it's actually one of the preconditions to flow, is that you know clearly what it is you are supposed to be doing. And that's not just as you start, but that's continuous. That moment by moment, you know what it is that you are to be doing, what you're supposed to be doing, what you want to be doing. And then the second precondition of, or it's actually the third precondition of flow, but we don't need to worry about the numbers, but very conducive to sport is that you get feedback about how you're going. So when you're doing sport, you tend to know because of the movement of the body. And as you get more skilled, you can tune into that feedback. You know how you're doing. And also, of course, there's many sources of external feedback, which can be helpful or not helpful, depending on your interpretation of them. But those two factors, clear goals and getting that feedback, that makes sport a setting that's conducive to flow. And the other factor that makes it conducive to flow is that there's always, within the sport setting, there are clearly defined gradients of challenge that you can move up through in terms of levels. And so one of the primary things to understand about flow that I touched on earlier is that it occurs when you challenge yourself. And so sport always provides plentiful opportunities for challenging ourselves. And then the other component that goes along with challenge that's really important to understand is that you have the skills to meet the challenge. And so you're developing your skills and that you trust your skills. Both of those things are critically important. So that's one setting. Having said that, Csikszentmihalyi, the founder of Flow, he and I actually wrote a book on flow in sports in 1999, so some years ago. Csikszentmihalyi has studied extensively in his lifetime. He died in 2021, but over a very long career, he studied flow in many different settings and found a consistency of experience. When someone's in flow, no matter what the setting, that experience is quite consistent. And that comes back to those 9 dimensions that we've been referring to. Those 9 dimensions tend to appear consistently, no matter, are you at work? Are you playing a game of chess? Are you playing basketball? Are you doing a surgical procedure? All of these settings have been studied for flow, and the key components of just being totally absorbed in what you're doing, enjoying what you're doing, feeling in control. We haven't really touched on that yet, but this sense that you're in control because you've got that challenge skill balance matched well. So
Yeah,
those are some of the
when I talk
areas.
to my students, flow is a part of the course that I'm currently teaching.
Oh, great.
And when I talk to them, I like to say that it's a state that you have the potential to experience when you're doing a challenging activity that you're good at. A lot of feedback from them is that video games are for them, according to their writing. I see that not necessarily sports, but definitely gaming and perhaps playing an instrument seem to be
Definitely.
the big sources of this state for them.
Absolutely, Ryan. You're spot on there. Gaming is an area where there's been quite a bit of research on flow, and that is because it's actually easier to examine flow in a setting that is more controlled. So in sport, there's so many extraneous variables, and you can't sort of be assessing somebody's physiology or what's happening in the brain. But in computer gaming, somebody's pretty stationary. They're in a confined space and they're interacting with the computer. And so there's more opportunity to then manipulate challenge and skill and to assess people's experience without interrupting things as much as in some other settings like sport. So, and also I think with gaming, for example, you've got clearly defined goals, like I was saying with sport, you're getting that feedback, right? That feedback's immediate about how you're doing. So you can
Right.
continually adjust how you're doing. So if we compare that to like your typical workday in whatever area somebody's working in, you may not be receiving much feedback about how you're going. And so, and also as a university student, you're in a course and you're working on an assignment and you're hoping that you're doing it right. But unless you go to your instructor and say, hey, could you look at this draft and give me some feedback? You really don't know. So you've got this uncertainty. So then you've got this anxiety about, is this right? Is this good enough? Until, you know, you get your exam paper or your assignment paper back and you get your grade and then you get some feedback. But by then it's too late, right? Whereas in sport and in gaming and also, as you mentioned, playing music, you're getting immediate feedback about how you're doing. And so if you can combine that feedback with not worrying about how well you're doing, but staying focused on the task and refocusing. So the feedback might be, well, you actually screwed up there, or you got that note out of tune or whatever. If you can just take that on board and seamlessly make an adjustment and come back to the task without evaluating, oh, well, that was really stupid. Why did I do that?
Mhm.
Then you can be more likely to get into flow or stay in flow. So I think music, gaming, sports, very conducive to being in flow.
And I think it's interesting based on your description there. It makes me wonder, because you have to have competence at the activity in order to be able to access a flow state, right?
Mm.
And it was interesting that you were saying, like, let's say you're writing a creative story or something like that. If
Mm-hmm.
you're a novice at writing and you're kind of worried about how it's going to be evaluated, you may not get into a flow state. But if you are experienced to the point that you can look at your own writing and get feedback, as in,
Mm.
I just wrote
Mm.
a paragraph and now I like it. It sounds great. Or internally you're going, nope, nope. You can actually do you think you can self generate that feedback, and
Oh,
is it the
definitely.
experience that can help you get into that flow
Mm.
state?
Definitely. I mean, that's a very important skill, actually. It's a skill that we have to develop. Now, some individuals develop that naturally, but I think for most of us, it needs to be a deliberate um, goal that we have, that we are going to be constantly seeking that feedback and not having to rely on external sources of feedback. I mean, that's where we can be more autonomous learners, isn't it? If we can receive the feedback and tune into the feedback and make adjustments, and at the same time not be evaluating yourself and bringing yourself down, but just focusing in on it a bit more objectively, kind of like sitting back and going like, yeah, well, yeah, that's a good paragraph, or that one flows well, or no, that one's really not as clear, and so I'm going to target that. I'm going to come back to that, but I'm feeling like I'm in a good rhythm, so I'm going to leave that for later. I'm going to keep going on this thread and so on. And so that's this continuous process of, yeah, paying attention to what you're doing and being able to make adjustments to stay on track towards the goal. So coming back to, my goal is to do X. How am I going in relation to X? Because of the feedback I'm getting, I know how I'm doing, and I'm not going to be questioning myself. I'm going to be focused on the task. I'm going to bring all the skills I have at this particular time to the task.
Now, a lot of the understanding around flow centers on how you're experiencing arousal, physiological
Mm,
arousal. And
mm,
what I mean by that is, in order to experience flow, you have to kind of be in this sweet spot of arousal, where if the task is too challenging or too easy, then you may not access this flow state. Can you talk a little bit about
mm.
about the sort of the boundaries of flow state? Like what is on the left
Yeah,
and the
sure.
right of that
Yeah.
sweet spot?
Yeah, well, you're referring to the flow channels, the figure, which is a very helpful figure actually, visually. I think when people see that figure, but basically to describe it, it's very simple. You've got a vertical axis, which is the challenge axis from low to high, and you've got a horizontal axis, which is the skill axis, again from low to high. They intersect. Where they intersect, those two lines, is your individual average level of challenge and skill. And when you go beyond, so you increase the challenge and you increase the skill, that's where the potential for flow occurs. Now to the left of that is arousal, as you mentioned. So a state of arousal is pretty much a neutral state to be in. That is, we have things happening at a physiological level that indicate that you know, we're experiencing characteristics of heightened energy, heart rate might be increasing, a sense of anticipation about, oh, this is challenging, and so on. And if we can stay focused and be with those experiences, and this is where meditation and mindfulness can be really helpful, we can like know, oh, my arousal level's increasing here. Is it the right level of arousal? Again, tuning into the feedback. Is it the right level of arousal for what I'm doing here? And if not, then bringing in some deep breathing to bring that arousal level down. But not being concerned about the fact that you have a high level of arousal, because for any performance, you need to have an increased level of arousal because you're doing something that's stretching your boundaries a little bit. And so whether it's in sport, whether it's in music, whether it's in public speaking, any of these areas that we consider performances, and having a high level of arousal is actually beneficial to performance if we can channel it into the performance. What happens is, for most of us, because arousal is very close to anxiety, which is the next channel in that challenge skill balance model, most of us tend to go, oh, I'm feeling nervous. I may not be able to do what I need to do here. And then we start worrying and we go into the anxiety channel, which is taking us further away from flow. And so it's about being comfortable with being uncomfortable to an extent, because, high arousal, it's not our normal state of functioning for most of us. And so, we're like, oh, this feels a bit different. If we can be okay with that, then we can shift into flow.
Yeah, the video that I always show um, when I'm talking about flow is of a juggler, a juggling routine,
Uh-huh.
because there's something about a juggling routine that looks challenging to a novice, and it's visually striking, but it really gives off this element of immersion in the activity, and and it uh, and it looks effortless. It is not an effortless activity, but it
Mm.
appears to be effortless. And I always,
Mm-hmm.
focus on that part, which is, it has to be, the activity needs to be on the cusp of difficulty, but not so difficult that it's daunting, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's very important about what is that relative balance of challenges and skills.
Now, in all your experience talking about flow, would you say that there are activities or categories of activities that people bring up to you that are commonly mistaken for flow? Like, things that people say, like a lot of my students say they got into flow when they were having a conversation, but
Mm,
it's a little tricky to determine if their experience would qualify. But do you notice any
mm.
commonalities in terms of examples that people think are flow, but you might push back and challenge them?
That's very interesting. I do think it's possible to get into flow in conversation, for sure. I mean, you might have experienced that yourself. Like, when you're podcasting, you just have this sense of connection, and both parties have dropped the self-consciousness, the evaluation, and so on, and not concerned with time, which is, we haven't talked about that yet, but that's like one of the characteristics of being in flow, and just focused on the task. And so, like in any conversation, that's possible for sure. But whether it is flow, I mean, as you say, it's pretty hard to determine. Um, if that conversation is just a chat between friends, well, is there a challenge skill balance there that's actually extending you or not? Well, if you're talking about the weather, probably not. But if you're talking about a psychological concept that you're both studying and you're trying to understand, or you've discovered something new, then yeah, for sure, I think it's possible. I think one
Hopefully
area,
that's where we're getting now. Well, this is the sweet spot of the interview.
the sweet
We're now,
spot, yeah,
yeah. Um,
that's it.
so do you think that there are personality precursors or even genetic predispositions that
Mm,
make it more likely that a person will enter flow? So again, this is kind of an out there
definitely.
question because it's independent of any activity that someone's doing. It's a disposition. But is there any evidence that there's some sort of disposition or trait that makes it more likely that you will access flow states?
Yeah, it's a great question. Csikszentmihalyi has written extensively about the autotelic personality. So the autotelic personality is considered to be a type of person who's more likely to experience flow, and the characteristics of an autotelic personality are that you are challenge seeking, as you like to stretch your boundaries, you like
Interesting.
to be always developing to the next level. You're very self-focused, you're focused on mastery, not on competition with other people and so on. Get drawn to that. It's all about self-improvement. You're very intrinsically motivated. That is, you are doing what you're doing, and everything that you approach, you do it out of a sense of curiosity and about of an interest to learn, and about enjoying what you're doing for what the feedback that activity gives you and what you learn from the activity. And so Csikszentmihalyi and then other people after him, there's a researcher, Dwight C., TSE, who worked with Csikszentmihalyi and Jean Nakamura at Claremont Graduate University, where Csikszentmihalyi last was. And he's looked at the autotelic personality and now is continuing to examine the autotelic personality and other psychological factors. So yes, there are, and these, in Mike's words, Csikszentmihalyi's words, these are the people. The people of flow are more likely to experience flow in their lives. Now, does that mean that if we don't have an autotelic personality, we can't experience flow? No, not at all. But yeah, there are some people, and you can probably see those people around. Everybody can probably think of people that they've seen, whether they know them personally or they've seen them perform, who they think those people seem to be able to tap into flow in what they're doing.
Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is why these flow states are so important to well-being and why they're tied
Mm,
into the well-being literature. And, there are lots of things that you could easily point to. My mind always goes to one of the elements of flow being a diminished sense of self, where
mm,
your identity, those voices in your head, those ruminating thoughts that tend to occupy a lot of people throughout the day, even more so with an anxious personality, that when you're diving into playing an instrument or you're playing a sport, that volume tends to go down, where such that you don't have time for internal thoughts about
mm.
whether or not you're good enough because you're so focused on that activity. And my mind goes to there as being as one of those explanatory factors is why flow is so helpful for well-being. But could you talk a little bit about why flow is important to well-being?
Yeah, well, that's a key question, isn't it? You know, it is essentially important, but I think it's not widely understood, and doesn't get the attention in psychology that other psychological constructs do. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's difficult to assess. You know, it's very difficult to assess any subjective experience. And most of us aren't able to just manufacture flow. There's not a flow switch. We don't just go, okay, well, there's an experiment coming up, so I need to get into flow. You know, that's very hard. And so it's a difficult area to examine, but just because it's difficult to examine, do we not examine it? No, like we just do the best we can with the measurement tools we have available to us. And as technology continues to develop, we will be better able to assess flow at multiple levels, as we sort of chatted a bit about before the interview. So why does it matter? It matters because quality of experience matters. And this is something that I refer to Csikszentmihalyi as Mike. His first name was Mihai. He's a Hungarian psychologist, but he spent all of his academic career in the US, and he went by the name Mike. So Mike argued strongly that the quality of experience we encounter as we go through life is extremely important and ultimately determines the extent to which life was worth living. That's a paraphrase of a quote from him. And I actually found, just as a personal example, when I initially was looking at flow and deciding to study it as a master's student and then PhD student, my interest was in elite athletes and how to understand elite athletes performing at their best. And so it's about how do we achieve this optimal performance state? And flow is an optimal psychological state for performance. And so that was my initial primary interest. And then I was doing both quantitative and qualitative research. So I was giving athletes questionnaires and I was talking to them. I was interviewing them. And I was interviewing them about what it was like to be in flow and, you know, how important were these experiences to them. And it just became so clear to me that they held their moments of when they're in flow as the most important of their athletic career. And after the interview would end, I have never had research participants thank me for allowing them to be a research participant, but I would have athletes thank me for asking them about the quality of experience. And they would say things like, as an athlete, everybody's always asking them questions about their performance. How did they do? Did they get a PR, PB? Did they win? What do they think about their performance? And they're like, nobody ever asked me about the quality of the experience. And so they were thanking me for this opportunity to sort of dive deep into what's that experience like when things are going really well. And they treasured these times. And I think anybody that's, you know, listening and can relate to their own times of being in flow, I think that for most of us, those times would be earmarked as some of the most important and treasured moments of our life. So yes, it matters because quality of experience matters.
So in these elite athlete populations, if you look at them, okay, so they're already competent at the activity. In fact, they're probably very, very competent at the activity. And so we have that check mark. And if they're an elite athlete, they're performing and practicing at a very high level, another checkbox. So we have the grounds ready for flow state. What are some things that get in the way for them?
Yes. Well, number one is lack of trust in skills in certain situations. Yes, they're very highly competent. They have the skills for the challenge. Let's say that is the case. That's not always the case, but let's say that challenge skill balance is closely matched. And with the challenge skill balance for flow, we actually want the challenges to be slightly higher than skills, because we haven't talked about the next channel of that challenge skill balance model that's to the right of flow, but that's a sense of control. So when you're in control, that's a very positive state to be in as well from a psychological point of view. Your skills slightly outweigh the challenge, so that differentiates control from flow, because in flow, the challenges slightly outweigh the skills. So when you're in that situation, what can happen? There's a potential for doubt. Okay? If
Interesting.
you've got a challenge that's slightly higher than your skills, there is that potential for doubt to come in. So then it comes down to the psychological skill set of the individual who puts themselves in a situation of high challenge. That yes, they've got the skills, but there's not 100% guarantee that they've got the skills for the challenge. So then are they going to trust themselves, or are they going to wait for the demonstration of the skill before they trust themselves? And that is not a great situation to be in sport, because you don't really have time to wait for the demonstration of the skills, because in that moments where, or that time frame where you're waiting to get to the point where you're like, yeah, I can do this, you've lost ground, obviously. And so I think there's a great quote from Michael Jordan that I'll paraphrase. I can't remember it exactly, but it's about, you've got to expect great things of yourself before you can actually do them. You've got to have, and Jordan was, a classic example of an athlete that believed in themselves, and also an athlete that achieved flow on the basketball court quite a lot, and did amazing things on the court. And so the thing that often gets in the way, despite being at an elite level, for many athletes and performers in other areas, not just sport, is that self-doubt comes in. You start to just have this little question of, can I do this? And if you listen to that thought in your mind and let that take you, where will it take you? It will take you to anxiety. So then you've got to be able to let go of it and come back to focusing on the task and trusting yourself. And so trusting your skills is key, and it's a difficult thing to do as well.
Now, so you mentioned Michael Jordan, and I think that's a nice segue into uh, something that I wanted to discuss with you, which is the dark side of flow. So one could make a case that not necessarily being in a flow state has severe downsides, but rather the frequency of pursuing the flow state may have some downsides. So hyper focus, for example, and at the cost of other important things in your life. What is your view of the dark side of flow? Do you feel like there are clear downsides that we can point to, and maybe some cautions when you start to go down this path of accessing flow states?
Well, the example you gave there, Ryan, about hyper focus, if that means that you're not paying attention to other important areas of your life, well, that's a downside, I guess. If you're like seeking flow and to the exclusion of anything else in your life. The thing is that for most of us, flow isn't that easy to obtain. So it's not really it's probably not going to be a problem for most of us, too much flow. I think one downside, though, is that if flow can be applied to activities that are antisocial, like criminal activities, because there's a high challenge. Robbing a bank, for example, that's a pretty high challenge. But like a thief thinks they've got, or maybe they do have really good skills in cracking the bank safe, and so they seek that out. They're like they're successful, they rob a bank, they get away with it, and so then they want to do it again. So flow can be achieved in a setting that is a very positive thing to be engaged in, or maybe not so positive. And so I guess that's a potential downside.
Well, and I remember hearing on a different podcast a quote from LeBron James was, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to the effect of, you have to hurt your loved ones if you want to be great. Right. In order to pursue that elite level of mastery of an activity, where you're probably experiencing flow states more than the average person, that
Mm,
once you start to dedicate yourself to a task and mastery, that it's
mm,
very easy to sort of become addicted to
mm,
that pursuit.
mm,
I don't know.
mm.
You've talked to a lot of elite athletes. Have you heard any stories like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, elite sport does require professional sport. Like example that you gave there, it requires an extreme dedication for sure. I don't think flow is the problem here. I think it's more that pursuit of excellence and the fact that in sport the bar is always increasing. There's always competitors coming up. Even if you're at the top of your sport, then you want to be. Then you're kind of concerned about the people that are going to take you off that top ranking and so on. So, like, I've interviewed Olympic gold medalists, and the reason that research study came about was a conversation with a coach and Olympic gold medalist about how once you achieve that very pinnacle of the sport, it's really hard to stay there. And it's very stressful. It's very stressful in that aftermath. If you're wanting to continue, like if you get your Olympic gold medal and you retire, all good. But if you stay in the sport, it's very, very difficult to then repeat or three-peat. And to do that requires an intense commitment. And yes, some other parts of your life are going to suffer.
Mhm.
That's the nature of high achievement, not just in sport. Like if we think about scientists who are pursuing something very important, trying to discover some new vaccine or whatever it is that they're working on, working in areas that are very important. Takes an extreme commitment, and they might spend very long hours in the lab, and they're not at home with the family. And so, yeah, that's something that's related to high achievement, not necessarily flow, but like the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of high achievement, which flow is associated with as a psychological state.
Now, in your career, you've worked in areas like education, like the workplace, to try to um, apply what we know about flow and the benefits of being in flow states to these domains. Let's just take a deep dive into work. Based on what we know about flow states and how they can be helpful, what are the things that you look at if you're talking to a manager or you're talking to someone who is in charge of people in terms of a
Mm-hmm.
workplace? How do you apply what we know about flow to this setting?
Mm. Yes, well, I think that work is actually a place where we can experience flow because we are challenged and we spend a lot of time there, right? Like if we are working, if we're a business professional or an employee, we spend a lot of time in that setting. So if we can have a situation where we've got challenging tasks to do and we've got an opportunity to develop our skills so that we are upping our skills as the challenge increases, we have the potential to experience flow. And with Csikszentmihalyi's research, he looked at different settings and the frequency of experiencing flow in different settings. And work was actually a setting that comes up as um, a place where we actually can experience quite a bit of flow. And people report that, except for one characteristic to flow that we've sort of talked a little bit about, which is the enjoyment of the experience and wanting to be doing it. So that's the one area that people don't endorse at work. They'd rather be doing something else than work because by definition it's work. You have to be doing it. But in terms of like how to achieve flow in work settings, it's those preconditions I talked about. It's that challenge skill balance, getting it right. Like there might be too many demands. You might be an executive running a company and you have too many demands on you. And so the challenge is too high relative to your skills. And so you need to do some things like delegate and so on to be able to get get things back to a more manageable place. You may need to prioritize in terms of like planning when you do things. You may need to build in recovery time. Like high achieving people tend to push themselves, and what I find is if I'm working with somebody in that space is to deliberately build in some downtime, and that can be just 5 minutes where you develop your breathing skills, and so that you can do a breathing practice and like just bring it down, bring the intensity level down a bit, particularly if you've got many different demands. You got this, you got that in your diary each day, and so on. So like if you just jump from one thing to the other, you get to the end of the day, you're exhausted, you come home, you can't be present for your family. Whereas if you can build in a little bit of recovery, a little bit of relaxation, a little bit of space, then it allows you to be able to bring your full focus to each subsequent task. So that's something that I often work on, is developing mindfulness skills so that they can then apply that in the workplace to be able to moderate their intensity level. Because if you are a high achieving person, the tendency is that you're expected to always be in that very like high intensity space, and nobody can operate in that high intensity space all the time. You've got to have some recovery built in.
Okay, so to wrap up, suppose you're just an average person who's listening right now, and they've heard about this idea of flow, and how it's commonly experienced with musicians and athletes, but they don't know where to start. Right? I would like to have access to this experience. What is
Mm-hmm.
what are your practical recommendations for somebody who is just like, I want some more of this. Where do I start?
Number one, find an activity that you enjoy, I think, and an activity where you can develop your skills in, which most activities have that opportunity. But I think, if you find something you enjoy, you're more likely to want to engage in it, and you're more likely to want to engage in it for intrinsic reasons. That is, it's enjoyable, it's fun, and there you're already putting into place a mindset of, I like doing this, I like getting engaged in it. So you're less likely to be distracted. So then you're more likely to be able to develop your ability to concentrate on the task, which then makes it closer for you to getting to flow. So find an enjoyable activity where you can stretch your skills so that you've got that challenge skill balance upping for you,
Mhm.
and engage in it regularly, and also be prepared to challenge yourself. So if you want to get into flow, just remember, you got to put yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit, just a little
Yeah.
bit, just stretch a little bit so that you do something. And maybe, everyday activities. Maybe some people really like cooking, and that's an activity where we can experience flow, a daily life activity. You can pop something in the microwave and eat it, and it's probably not a flow experience. Or you can decide to follow quite a complex recipe, and there's like multiple demands, and it's not something you've ever done before, and you're doing it for someone important in your life, and so there's like that challenge, that uncertainty. But you decide to trust your skills, and you focus in on each step and so on, and you create something. So that that's just one example, but like you can apply it to any activity in your life. So something you enjoy, be prepared to step into a high challenge out of your comfort zone, and then listen to the feedback that you're getting, and then finally try not to doubt yourself. Doubts will come in, be okay with that, let them go, come back to the task.
Well, great. Thank you so much for this discussion on flow. I think I have all I need to start. Maybe I'll start cooking something more complex. Although I'm pretty happy with the flow I experience when I make my scrambled eggs. So maybe
That's good.
maybe I'm still at the right level of challenge. But thank you so much for being on today, Dr. Sue Jackson.
Well, it's been a lovely discussion with you, Ryan, and thank you for your excellent questions that really target in on what flow is and why it matters.